They called it Ethelberg, not a colony, but a covenant. Humanity's promise to itself that it could be more than just a conqueror of worlds. It was nestled in the gossamer arms of the Serpent's Nebula, a single city station built into a crystalline asteroid that orbited a placid blue giant. For 70 years, it had been the Sol system's finest mind, a sanctuary for poets, philosophers, mathematicians, and artists who sought to answer the great questions in the quiet cathedral of deep space. It produced no ore, no grain, no weapons. It produced only thought. Its transmissions were the lifeblood of an interstellar renaissance, symphonies composed from the gravitational waves of dying stars, ethical treatises born from the observation of non-sentient alien ecosystems, paintings that use the nebula's shifting light as their canvas. Ethelberg was where humanity went to dream, a testament to peace on the savage frontier of the known galaxy. Then, on a Tuesday, by Earth's reckoning, the dream ended. The symphony went silent mid-crescendo. The philosophical debates broadcasting on encrypted channels were replaced by a dead, flat hiss. The constant stream of data, the poetry, the frantic, joyful noise of 10 million of humanity's brightest souls simply stopped. The United Directorate at first logged it as a standard communications blackout. The nebula was a temperamental beast, prone to subspace squalls that could sever contact for days. They dispatched a maintenance drone, a standard procedure. But when the drone failed to report back, they sent a courier ship. It, too, vanished into silence. A week of unnerving quiet stretched into a month, and the quiet began to feel less like an absence and more like a presence. A military scout frigate, the Pathfinder, was rerouted from its patrol, its crew of hardened veterans grumbling about a milk run. They arrived to a vision of perfect, horrifying peace. Ethelberg was pristine. The crystalline spires glittered in the light of the blue giant. The docking bays were open and welcoming. The city's energy signature was stable, life support optimal. There was no sign of struggle, no debris field, no scorching from weapons fire. But the 10 million souls were gone, not their bodies. Their bodies were still there. The crew of the Pathfinder found them in the art galleries, staring blankly at masterpieces. They found them in lecture halls, seated in neat rows, their mouths slightly agape as if waiting for a pronouncement that would never come. They found families in their homes, gathered around tables set for dinner, their forks frozen halfway to their lips. They were alive, their hearts beating a slow, steady rhythm, their lungs drawing breath, but their eyes were vacant, reflecting nothing. They were statues of flesh, puppets whose strings had been cut, their minds wiped clean as a formatted drive. The seasoned captain of the Pathfinder, a man who had seen vacuum sickness turn a crew inside out and witnessed the bloody aftermath of the Triton Rebellion, locked himself in his quarters and wept for 3 hours after his first away team reported their findings. This was not death. It was an erasure, an unwriting of the human soul on a planetary scale. Dr. Aris Thorne felt the silence before he officially heard the news. He was in his lab at the Tycho Institute on Luna, mapping the fossilized neural networks of a long-extinct silicon-based life form, when he noticed the Ethelberg channels on his research feed had gone dark. He'd tried to hail his sister, Lena, the chief dialectician of the colony's philosophical council, assuming she was simply lost in her work. Now, watching the classified military feed patched directly to his terminal, his lab felt like a vacuum chamber, crushing the air from his lungs. The footage was raw, taken from a Marine's helmet cam. The camera panned across a lecture hall filled with the living dead, their faces smooth and placid, devoid of thought or memory. The Marine knelt before one of them, a young woman, and waved a hand in front of her unblinking eyes. No response. He checked her pulse. Steady. He shined a light in her pupils. They didn't even contract. And beneath the Marine's ragged breathing, Eris could hear it, a sound the camera's microphone was barely able to register, a low, pervasive, subliminal hum. It was a single, pure, unwavering tone, a note of absolute order in a place that had once celebrated the beautiful chaos of human thought. The official report from the Directorate was released 24 hours later, and it struck humanity not like a thunderclap, but like a neurotoxin. The news of a massacre would have sparked rage. The news of a plague would have sparked fear. This sparked a unique and profound horror, a violation so fundamental it bypassed all other emotions. Humanity had fought wars over territory, over resources, over ideology, but this was a war on consciousness itself. It was an attack on the very thing that defined them. The response was not debated in senates or assemblies. It was a visceral, species-wide reflex. On Mars, the terraforming engines that had worked for 2 centuries to build an atmosphere were retasked overnight. Their immense power diverted to the orbital shipyards, where the skeletal frames of new dreadnoughts were being laid. On Earth, the global stock markets were suspended indefinitely, and every major corporation from industrial manufacturing to entertainment was nationalized under the war powers mandate. The civilian starliner fleets, vessels of tourism and trade, were recalled and gutted, their luxurious interiors torn out to make way for missile racks and troop bays. Humanity had always been a fractured, bickering species, but the silence from Ethelberg united them in a cold, silent fury. They didn't want justice. They didn't even want revenge. They wanted to answer an act of ultimate violation with an act of ultimate negation. The investigators on Ethelberg found only one clue. It wasn't a symbol burned into a wall. It was a pattern woven into the very fabric of the tragedy. Every victim, all 10 million of them, exhibited the same anomalous neural activity. Their brains, once kaleidoscopic hubs of complex thought, now resonated with a single, synchronized frequency. When visualized on a deep wave scanner, the pattern was a perfect, unending sine wave, a signature of absolute, enforced simplicity. It was a broadcast, a signal that had overwritten their minds, and it was still faintly echoing through the station's corridors, that same low, pervasive hum. Eris Thorne was escorted from his lab by 2 grim-faced officers of the Directorate's Special Armistice Corps. He was no soldier, no politician. He was a neuroarchaeologist, a quiet academic who preferred the company of extinct alien minds to living human ones. But his obscure doctoral thesis from 30 years prior was suddenly the most important document in the Sol system. It was titled Hypothetical Frameworks of Coherent Consciousness Entities, and in it, he had theorized the existence of a form of life that perceived individual, chaotic sentience not as life, but as a malignant cosmic noise. He had called them, in a fit of academic fancy, the silencers. He had never expected to be proven right. He now stood on the observation deck of the IDS Unbroken Vow, the flagship of the newly formed Grand Armada, a vessel whose very existence had been a state secret until last week. He stood before Fleet Marshal Eva Rostova, a woman carved from granite and pragmatism, her face a mask of controlled fury. In orbit around Jupiter, a fleet unlike any ever assembled was taking shape. 800,000 ships, from tiny, wasp-like interceptors to city-sized carriers, a river of steel and plasma that blotted out the stars. It was the roar of a species that had been violated in its most sacred place. "Doctor, Rostova's voice was like grinding metal. "Your theory is all we have. This enemy, these silencers. What are they? How do we fight them?" Eris looked out at the terrifying, beautiful armada. At the raw, untempered power of a species pushed beyond the brink. He saw not a fleet of salvation, but a fist being swung blindly in the dark. "Marshal," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "you have to understand. You are preparing to wage war on a philosophy. You are mobilizing this entire fleet to kill a sound. We don't have weapons for that. We don't even have a language for it." Rostova's gaze didn't soften. She gestured toward the swirling red eye of Jupiter. "We will make them understand our language, Doctor. We will answer their silence with fire and thunder until the universe itself goes deaf." The fleet awaited its orders. It was the physical manifestation of humanity's grief, a weapon forged from a broken heart. Eris Thorn, the man who understood the enemy better than anyone, felt a chilling certainty deep in his soul. This fleet wasn't heading toward a battle. It was a pilgrimage to a new kind of hell, and he was being brought along to translate the screams. The hum of Ethelberg was a requiem, and the thunder of humanity's response was about to begin. The journey into the void was not a silent one. For 3 weeks, the Grand Armada moved through the warped, indigo corridors of subspace, and the sound was a constant, deafening roar. It was the sound of 800,000 engines straining in unison, of overworked life support systems groaning in ships never designed for military duty, and of the ceaseless chatter across 1,000,000 comm channels as captains and crew tried to hold the largest fleet in history together. The Armada was a city in motion, a nation of pure, directed rage screaming through the non-space between stars. For Dr. Eris Thorn, it was a cacophony that did little to drown out the memory of Ethelberg's perfect, terrible hum. He had been given a laboratory in the deep, shielded core of the unbroken vow, a space filled with humming servers and shimmering holographic displays. His only companion was the silence he was chasing. His task, assigned by Rostova herself, was to triangulate the origin of the Ethelberg frequency. It was a ghost, a signal with no discernible energy signature. Yet its psychic resonance had been burned into the neural pathways of 10 million people. Using the synchronized brainwaves of the victims as a template, Eris had designed a new kind of sensor, a conceptual antenna that didn't listen for energy, but for echoes in the collective unconscious of the human species. It was esoteric, half-mad science, but it was working. A faint thread, a single, pure note, was pulling them across the galaxy. His military liaison, a stern, sharp-jawed man named Commander Yorick, visited him daily. Yorick represented the fleet's sole pragmatic, impatient, and utterly convinced that the solution to any problem could be found in the precise application of overwhelming force. He would stand with his arms crossed, watching Eris calibrate his delicate instruments, his expression a mixture of skepticism and disdain. "Any ghosts in the machine today, Doctor?" he'd ask, his voice dripping with condescension. "Find the spook's home address yet?" Eris would just nod, adjusting a waveform on his monitor. "The signal is becoming clearer, Commander. Less of an echo, more of a direct broadcast. We're getting closer." Yorick would grunt. "Good. The sooner we have a target, the sooner the Marshal can give the order and we can end this nightmare." To Yorick, and to most of the fleet, Eris was a necessary but irritating delay, a divining rod they had to follow before the real work of cleansing fire could begin. They didn't understand that the signal itself was the weapon, the enemy, and the battlefield all at once. Eris tried to explain this to Marshal Rostova during one of their infrequent meetings on the flagship's command bridge. The bridge was a cavern of polished chrome and dark glass, the star-strewn void visible through a vast armored viewport. Rostova stood with her back to him, watching the river of ships that followed hers. "They do not kill." "Marshal," Eris said, his voice quiet but firm. "They overwrite." Think of it not as an army but as a conversion event. Ethelberg wasn't a casualty, it was a sermon. They are missionaries, and their gospel is silence. Rostova turned, her eyes like chips of ice. "My cousin was on Ethelberg. Doctor, he was a poet. He wrote a sonnet about the birth of a star that made a generation of hardened freighter captains weep. Now his heart beats. He breathes air. But the man who wrote those words is gone. If that is not death, then the word has no meaning. They are butchers, and I will treat them as such. But you cannot shoot a frequency, Marshal. You cannot bomb an idea." Eris protested, his voice rising with a desperation he couldn't contain. "Sending this fleet against them is like trying to cure a plague with a sledgehammer. You'll smash the patient to pieces, and the disease will just laugh." Rostova stepped closer, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "Then let it laugh. Let it hear us coming. I have 800,000 sledgehammers in my arsenal, Doctor, and I will swing every last one of them. Find me the source." "That is your only concern." Defeated, Eris returned to his lab. The thread was stronger now, pulling taut. He fed the final coordinates to the ship's navigation AI. The origin point was a solitary star system in a desolate, uncharted nebula at the edge of the Perseus Arm, a place cartographers had labeled Lacuna, the empty space. A few hours later, the klaxons blared. Not a sound of panic, but of arrival. The transition from the chaotic vortex of subspace to the cold stillness of real space was jarring. The roar of the armada ceased, replaced by the low hum of readiness. Aris made his way to the bridge, joining the assembled officers as they stared out the main viewport. The system was wrong. Its star was a sickly, pale white, and it cast no shadows. It illuminated 5 planets, all of them perfect, gray, featureless spheres. They were not made of rock or gas. They were unnaturally smooth, like polished marbles, reflecting the star's sterile light with a dead, flat sheen. There were no asteroid belts, no cosmic dust, no comforting chaos of a natural system. It was a place that had been tidied, sanitized, and in the center, orbiting the star in a mathematically perfect ellipse, was the source of the signal. It wasn't a ship or a station. It was a planet, once a gas giant by the looks of its immense size. But it had been changed. It was a latticework of crystalline structures, a cage of impossible geometry built around a core that pulsed with a soft, internal luminescence. It hummed not just in Eris's mind, but on every sensor on the bridge. It was Ethelberg's requiem, amplified a trillionfold, a symphony of absolute crushing order. "That's it," Yorick breathed, a note of awe mixing with his hatred. "The nest." As if in response to their arrival, things began to emerge from the 5 gray planets. They didn't launch or fly. They simply appeared in the void, phasing into existence. They were perfect shapes, cubes of absolute black, spheres of mirrored silver, tetrahedrons that seemed to absorb the light around them. There were hundreds of them, then thousands, assembling in a flawless, silent grid between the human fleet and the glowing lattice world. They had no engines, no viewports, no weapon emplacements. They were concepts given form, the physical embodiment of the silence they served. They were the silencers. Rostova's face was a mask of cold resolve. She watched the silent, geometric fleet assemble before her, her knuckles white where she gripped the command lectern. "All ships," she commanded, her voice echoing through the bridge and across the entire armada. "Target their primary vessels. On my mark, unleash the storm." Eris felt a cold dread wash over him. "Marshal, wait. We don't know what they're capable of. We need to analyze their defenses. We know what they did." She cut him off, her gaze locked on the enemy. "That is all I need to know. Fire." The word was a death sentence. 800,000 warships obeyed as one. The void erupted. Humanity's rage, pent up for weeks, was finally given voice. A tidal wave of destruction washed across the system. Plasma cannons fired bolts of stellar fire. Railguns launched slugs of dense metal at near light speed. And thousands of nuclear-tipped torpedoes painted streaks of incandescent light against the black. It was the most concentrated volley of firepower in human history, enough to shatter a continent, to boil an ocean, to extinguish a small sun. It was a man-made supernova, a roar of defiance aimed at the heart of the silence. And it did nothing. The spheres did not shatter. The cubes did not melt. The tetrahedrons did not flinch. As the wave of destruction reached them, it simply ceased. The plasma dissipated into harmless gas. The railgun slugs stopped dead in space and were gently disassembled into atoms. The torpedoes, just meters from their targets, went inert, their warheads rendered into non-fissile metal. There were no explosions, no flares of energy shields. The silencers had not defended against the attack. They had simply unmade it. They had imposed their own reality on the volley, and in their reality, such chaotic things as explosions were not permitted to exist. A stunned, horrified silence fell over the bridge of the unbroken vow. Tactical officers stared at their screens in disbelief, their displays showing 0 damage inflicted. Yorick's jaw hung open. Rostova's iron composure finally cracked, a flicker of pure shock in her eyes. "All batteries," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Fire again." But it was too late. The silencers responded. They did not fire back. They did not move. The great lattice world at the center of the system pulsed once, a single, deep, resonant note that washed over the human armada. It was not a wave of energy. It was a wave of pure meaning, a broadcast of absolute certainty. On the bridge, Eris screamed and collapsed, clutching his head as the hum he had been chasing finally found him. It was a voice, a thought, a command that echoed in every human mind simultaneously. "Be still." Out in the void, a forward cruiser, the IDS Agincourt, went dark. Not an explosive death, but a quiet one. Its engine signatures remained stable. Its life support readings were nominal. Its running lights stayed on. But every communication channel, every biometric feed, every sign of a living, thinking crew went silent. It drifted, a ghost ship in a fleet of the damned. Its 10,000 crew members now part of the choir, their minds overwritten, their souls tuned to the endless, placid hum of the silencers. Rostova stared at the dead ship, then at Aris writhing on the floor, and for the first time since Ethelberg, the fleet marshal of the Grand Armada looked afraid. Her thunder had failed. Her fire had been quenched, and the silence was just beginning its sermon. The silence was not an absence of sound. It was a presence. It flooded the comm channels, a thick, suffocating static that was more orderly than noise. It pressed against the hulls of the ships and seeped into the minds of their crews. The pulse from the lattice world had been a single, devastating chord, and its resonance lingered, a psychic aftershock that left the Grand Armada stunned and reeling. One by one, ships began to fall silent, not in explosions, but in quiet, orderly succession. The IDAS Valiant, a frontline dreadnought, ceased all transmissions. The Stardust Drifter, a refitted civilian hauler, went dark. A whole squadron of Viper-class interceptors, the fastest ships in the fleet, simply stopped maneuvering and began to drift in perfect, placid formation. The silencers were not destroying the fleet. They were acquiring it. They were harvesting minds, turning vessels of war into silent monuments. On the bridge of the Unbroken Vow, panic was a cold, creeping vine. Officers who had faced down pirate fleets and braved the gravitational horrors of black holes now stared at their consoles with wide, terrified eyes. Every few seconds, another friendly icon on the tactical display would turn from green to gray. Another ship full of comrades and loved ones erased from the war. Marshal Rostova stood frozen, her face pale. The sheer, absolute failure of her strategy laid bare. Her sledgehammer had shattered against an unmovable, untouchable idea. "Get the doctor to the medbay," she finally barked, the command breaking the spell of horror that had gripped the bridge. Two Marines hauled Eris Thorne's unconscious body from the floor. He was still twitching, muttering incomprehensible fragments of words, his mind a battleground where the silencer's song was fighting against the chaos of his own human consciousness. As they carried him away, Commander Jorik, his face ashen, turned to Rostova. "Marshal, what are your orders? We can't fight them. Our weapons are useless." Rostova's gaze was fixed on the silent, geometric fleet of the enemy. They hadn't moved. They hadn't attacked again. They were simply waiting, patient as gods, as their single broadcast continued its methodical, relentless work. "Analysis," she gritted out, her voice a low rasp. "I want to know how they do it. I want to know what that pulse was. I want to know why some ships are falling and others aren't. Find me a weakness." The ship's science officers, their initial shock giving way to a frantic and desperate energy, began to work. They analyzed the lingering resonance of the pulse, replayed sensor logs, and cross-referenced the schematics of the fallen ships. A pattern began to emerge. The ships that fell first were the older ones, the retrofitted civilian vessels, the ones with less sophisticated psychic shielding in their comms and neural interface systems. The newer, purely military vessels, especially flagships like the Unbroken Vow with their experimental psychic dampeners, were holding out longer. It wasn't about the thickness of their armor, but the resilience of their systems against mental intrusion. The silencer's weapon wasn't aimed at the ships, it was aimed at the minds of the people inside them. In the medbay, Eris awoke with a gasp, the hum in his head now a constant, whispering companion. It spoke to him, not in words, but in pure concepts of balance, of order, of the cosmic error of individuality, of the peace that came with surrender. It showed him visions of a universe without conflict, without pain, without thought, a perfect, crystalline lattice of existence where every particle was in its proper place, resonating at the same, correct frequency. It was beautiful, seductive, and utterly horrifying. A medical officer was shining a light in his eyes. "Dr. Thorne, can you hear me? Your brain activity is off the charts." Eris pushed the light away, sitting up, The hum receded to the back of his mind, a background noise he could now, with effort, ignore. He had been inside the signal. He had touched the mind of the enemy. "I know how they do it," he said, his voice hoarse. He was rushed back to the bridge, the medical officer trailing behind him, protesting that he needed rest. He ignored her. As he stepped onto the command deck, all eyes turned to him. "It's a resonance cascade," he explained, walking shakily toward the central holotable. "They're not broadcasting power. They're broadcasting a pattern, a key. They find the unique resonant frequency of a complex consciousness of a human mind, and they broadcast a perfectly inverted wave. It's a form of active noise cancellation for the soul. They don't destroy the mind, they nullify it, leaving only the basic, autonomic functions behind." "So the psychic shielding is helping?" Jorik asked. "It's delaying it," Eris corrected. "Like putting cotton in your ears to block out a scream. Eventually, the scream gets through. They are patient. They will simply keep broadcasting until every mind in this fleet is tuned to their frequency." A grim silence fell over the bridge. They were in a cage, being slowly, methodically lobotomized by an enemy they couldn't touch. "But there's a flaw in their logic," Eris continued, a spark of desperate hope in his eyes. "Their philosophy is their weakness. They crave absolute order, perfect symmetry. Their attack is uniform, a single, pure note broadcast across the entire system." He looked directly at Rostova. "What is the one thing they cannot comprehend? The one thing that is the absolute antithesis of their existence?" Rostova stared at him, her mind racing, and then her eyes widened in understanding. "Chaos," she whispered. "Precisely," Eris said. "We can't fight them with order, with structured battle plans and coordinated volleys. We have to fight them with noise, with chaos, with pure, unadulterated, unpredictable madness." A new plan was born, not of strategy, but of desperation. Rostova, her faith in military doctrine shattered, placed her trust in the one man who seemed to understand the enemy. She gave Eris full command of the fleet's communication and sensor arrays. The order that went out was unlike any ever given in the history of warfare. "Cease all coordinated attacks. All ships are to act independently. Fire at will, at anything and everything. Overload your engines. Detonate your own munitions short of the target. Scramble your comms with poetry, with screaming, with nursery rhymes. Play music, every kind of music, all at once. Project Random, chaotic energy signatures. Make this system so loud, so messy, so painfully, chaotically alive that their perfect signal is drowned in the static." It was an order for anarchy. For a moment, there was hesitation across the fleet. Captains trained for discipline and order recoiled at the command to embrace chaos. But as another dreadnought fell silent, the desperation broke through. The fleet complied. The result was a glorious, terrifying symphony of madness. Ships broke formation, firing their weapons in random directions, their plasma bolts creating a web of purposeless energy. One captain broadcasted the entire works of a 21st century death metal band on all frequencies, while another had his crew recite nonsensical Vogon poetry. Torpedoes were launched not at the enemy, but at each other, detonating in beautiful, pointless blossoms of light. Engines were flared to overload, spewing raw, chaotic radiation into the system. The cold, orderly space of the Lacuna system was transformed into a Jackson Pollock painting of light, energy, and sound. It was humanity at its most illogical, its most emotional, its most beautifully and defiantly insane. And it worked. The steady, methodical conversion of ships stopped. The perfect grid of the silencer fleet flickered. Their flawless geometry seemed to waver, as if the sheer, unpredictable noise of the human armada was an irritant, a dissonance they could not process. For the first time, they reacted. A group of the silver spheres moved, not to attack, but to reorient, attempting to form a tighter, more focused formation, as if to shield themselves from the psychic shrapnel of humanity's madness. "We've got them off balance," Jorik shouted, a wild, incredulous grin on his face. "They don't know how to handle this." "It's not enough to distract them," Eris said, his hands flying across a console, rerouting the energy of the flagship itself. "We're just confusing them. We need to hurt them. We need to create a weapon out of chaos. Marshal, I need you to give me the unbroken vow." Rostova didn't hesitate. "She's yours, Doctor. What are you going to do?" Eris looked at the great lattice world, the source of the signal, the heart of the silence. Their greatest strength is their unity, their shared consciousness, their perfect, singular note. "I'm going to introduce a little feedback into the system." He began to work, using the principles he had discovered not to block the silencer signal, but to capture it. The unbroken vow's massive sensor arrays, designed to detect the faintest of energy signatures across light years, were retasked. They became a net, gathering the pure, orderly frequency of the silencers. But he didn't nullify it. He fed it into the ship's main reactor core, a contained singularity that warped space-time to generate power. Inside the reactor, the perfect void orderly wave was twisted, corrupted, and amplified by the chaotic, unpredictable energies of a captive black hole. He was taking their song of silence and turning it into a scream. The ship began to shudder violently. Alarms blared across the bridge. "The reactor core is destabilizing," the chief engineer yelled over the intercom. "Whatever you're doing, Doctor, it's tearing the ship apart." "Just a little longer," Eris muttered, sweat pouring down his face. "We need more chaos." He looked at Rostova. "I need you to broadcast something to them, something from you, the most chaotic, emotional, purely human thing you can think of." Rostova stared at him, then at the image of the lattice world on the main screen. She closed her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was not that of a fleet marshal. It was the voice of a woman who had lost everything. She recited the sonnet her cousin had written, the one about the birth of a star. Her voice, filled with grief, with love, with rage, was fed into the chaotic feedback loop, adding the final, unpredictable element. The hum in Eris's head became a shriek. The unbroken vow groaned like a dying beast. And then, Eris slammed his hand down on a final control. "Fire," he whispered. A beam of pure, weaponized chaos. A discordant symphony of a corrupted signal and a grieving heart shot from the unbroken vow and struck the lattice world. There was no explosion, but the world, the heart of the silencers, screamed. Its internal light flickered wildly, and fractures of pure, black void spiderwebbed across its crystalline surface. They had found a way to make silence bleed. The scream was not a sound. It was a rupture in the fabric of the system's perfect order. The lattice world, the source of the silencer's monolithic consciousness, shuddered violently, its internal luminescence flickering from a steady, placid glow to a chaotic, strobing pulse of agony. The beam from the unbroken vow was not a weapon of energy, but a contagion of thought, a virus of pure, undiluted human emotion and unpredictable quantum noise injected directly into the heart of their serene, unified mind. The effect on the Silencer fleet was instantaneous and catastrophic. Their perfected geometric grid shattered. The mirrored spheres turned dull, their surfaces rippling as if the reality holding them together was losing its integrity. The black cubes began to drift aimlessly, some spinning slowly, others simply ceasing to exist, fading into nothingness like a bad thought. The unity that had been their greatest strength was now their greatest vulnerability. The pain of their central consciousness was the pain of every individual unit, and they had no concept of how to process it. They were a single mind experiencing a seizure. On the bridge of the unbroken vow, the crew stared in stunned silence. The constant, oppressive psychic hum that had permeated the system was gone, replaced by a chaotic, fractured shriek that echoed in the back of their minds. It was the sound of a god having a nightmare. "Status report," Rostova's voice cut through the awe. "Did it work? Are they breaking?" A tactical officer, his eyes wide, looked up from his console. "Marshal, their formations are gone. They're not responding. Their energy signatures are fluctuating wildly. I don't think they know what to do. It's like they've all gone insane at once." Eris Thorn slumped against his console, breathing heavily, the psychic backlash of his weapon leaving him drained and nauseous. "We didn't kill them," he rasped, wiping a trickle of blood from his nose. "We deafened them. We scream so loud they can't hear themselves think anymore. But it won't last. A mind that vast will learn to compartmentalize the pain. It will reboot. We have to press the advantage. Now." Rostova's predatory instinct, which had been so useless against the Silencer's passive attack, now flared back to life. Her eyes, which had been filled with uncertainty, now burned with a cold, hard fire. She saw an enemy that was wounded, confused, and for the first time, vulnerable. "All ships!" she roared, her voice booming with renewed authority. "Target the lattice world, conventional ordnance, everything we have. I want a sustained, concentrated barrage on Dr. Thorne's point of impact. If they can feel pain, let's give them an agony they'll never forget." The human fleet, which moments before had been a chaotic orchestra of madness, now snapped back into lethal military precision. The random noise ceased, replaced by the unified roar of thousands of engines maneuvering into attack formation. The chaos had served its purpose. Now, the sledgehammer would fall. A second wave of destruction, more focused and sustained than the first, slammed into the wounded lattice world. This time, the Silencer's defenses, fractured by their own internal chaos, failed to simply unmake the attack. The torpedoes detonated. The plasma cannons scored deep, molten gouges into the crystalline structure. The railgun slugs, no longer meeting a conceptual barrier, punched through, shattering continent-sized facets of the planet-sized being. For the first time, humanity was drawing blood. The shriek from the lattice world intensified, and now it began to fight back, not with cold, orderly logic, but with the thrashing, panicked rage of a wounded animal. The 5 gray, featureless planets, which had been silent observers, now came to life. Their smooth surfaces cracked open, revealing not cities or weapons, but something far more horrifying. They were eggs, and they were hatching. From the shattered shells of the gray worlds emerged beings of pure, chaotic geometry, creatures that seemed to be made of folded space and captured light. They were not the calm, perfect shapes of the silencer fleet. They were their antibody, their immune system, the unrestrained chaos they kept locked away to defend themselves. They were jagged, asymmetrical, constantly shifting monstrosities that defied physics and sanity. They were the silencer's own inner demons, unleashed. "What in God's name are those?" Jorik breathed, watching the new arrivals swarm toward the human fleet. "They're not trying to convert us anymore," Eris said, while his face pale. "They're trying to delete us." The battle that followed was not one of strategy, but of pure survival. The new creatures, the aberrations, as the tactical AI quickly dubbed them, were raw, physical force. They moved at impossible speeds, phasing through conventional attacks and tearing through hulls with claws made of warped gravitational fields. A human frigate, the Dauntless, was hit by one. It didn't explode, it was simply unraveled. Its component atoms were pulled apart and scattered across a kilometer of space in a glittering, beautiful, and utterly lethal cloud. The Grand Armada, which had been built to fight a conventional war of ordnance and armor, was being dismantled by creatures that treated the laws of physics as mere suggestions. The chaos that had been their greatest weapon was now being turned against them. The aberrations were pure, weaponized chaos, and they were far better at it than humanity could ever be. The Unbroken Vow shuddered as one of the creatures raked its flank. The hit was not physical, it was conceptual. On the port side of the ship, the concept of distance was temporarily suspended. Corridors stretched into infinity, while crew members in the same room found themselves light years apart. The ship's AI struggled to reassert the laws of physics, its synthesized voice stuttering with effort. Rostova stood on the bridge, watching her fleet being torn apart. For every aberration they managed to destroy, and a few were destroyed, by concentrating the fire of a dozen dreadnoughts on a single point, 3 more would emerge from the gray worlds. The Lattice world, though still under constant bombardment, was beginning to heal. The fractures on its surface were sealing. Its internal light was stabilizing. It was adapting, learning from the pain. "We can't win this fight, Marshal," Jorik said, his voice grim. "We've hurt them, but we've just unleashed something worse. We have to retreat." Rostova looked at Eris. "Doctor, you got us into this. Get us out." Eris was staring at the Lattice world, a new, horrifying thought taking shape in his mind. "We can't retreat," he said softly. "Look at the system. Look at what they're doing." He pointed to the main display. The star, the sickly white sun at the center of the system, was beginning to dim. The aberrations were not just attacking the fleet, they were consuming the system's energy, drawing power directly from the star to fuel their assault and to heal the central consciousness. "This wasn't just their home," Eris whispered. "It's a farm, a power station. They're not just a consciousness, they're a civilization, a vast, galaxy-spanning one." Ethelberg wasn't a random act of cruelty, it was a test. They were testing the noise level of our species, and we responded by bringing the loudest noise in history right to their front door. We haven't just picked a fight with an army. We've declared war on an entire state of being. And the full terrifying scope of their situation finally dawned on the bridge crew. They were not soldiers fighting an enemy. They were bacteria fighting a god. And they had just made it angry. Rostova's face was set like stone. The choice was simple and brutal. They could retreat, allowing the silencers to heal, to learn from this encounter, and to eventually come for humanity with a new, more perfect form of silence, one against which chaos would no longer be a defense. Or they could end it here, now. at the cost of everything they had. "Doctor," she said, her voice devoid of all emotion. "Your weapon. The feedback loop. Can you do it again?" "I can't," Eris said, shaking his head. "They've adapted. They're shielding the lattice world with a layer of the same chaotic energy the aberrations are made of. The signal can't get through. It's like they've learned to scream back." "Then we have to get closer," Rostova said. Her gaze fell upon the flagship's main reactor gauge. "We need a louder scream." Auric understood immediately. "Marshall, no, you can't mean. The Unbroken Vow is the most powerful vessel ever built by human hands," Rostova said, her voice calm. "Its singularity core is a chained star. If we overload the containment fields right next to that lattice, we can create a chaotic event so powerful it might just be able to tear a hole in their perfect reality, a wound they can't heal." It was suicide, a glorious, desperate, and utterly final act of defiance. Eris looked at the fleet marshal, seeing not a soldier, but a force of nature, the embodiment of humanity's stubborn refusal to go quietly into the night. "It might work," he said quietly. "The physics are theoretical, but a raw singularity detonation, collapsing in on itself, the chaotic information released would be nearly infinite. It wouldn't just be a scream, it would be a new Big Bang, confined to a single point." Rostova nodded once. "Yorick, you have the con. Evacuate the fleet. Get as many ships out of the blast radius as you can. Tell them we bought them time. Tell them to learn from this. Tell them to get quieter." She turned to Eris. "As for you, Doctor, I have one last order for you. Get off my ship." Eris stared at her, then at the swirling chaos outside the viewport. He thought of his sister, Lena, her brilliant mind now a silent, placid lake. This was not just for humanity. This was for her. "No, Marshall," he said, a strange sense of peace settling over him. "I've been chasing this signal my whole life. I think I'd like to see where it ends." Rostova looked at the quiet academic, the man who had thought the unthinkable and given them a chance. And for the first time, she smiled. It was a sad, grim, but deeply respectful smile. "Very well, Doctor. To the end of the line, then." She turned to the helm. "Helmsman, set a course for the heart of that monster. Maximum velocity." The Unbroken Vow, pride of the human fleet, turned its nose toward the shrieking, healing god at the center of the system. It was no longer a warship. It was a message, a final, defiant roar aimed at the heart of silence itself. The final voyage of the Unbroken Vow was a descent into unreality. The ship, the pinnacle of human order and engineering, was assaulted not just by the claws of the aberrations, but by the fundamental unraveling of the space it occupied. Hull plates didn't buckle. They momentarily forgot they were solid, phasing into translucent states that revealed the screaming void beyond. Corridors twisted into Escher-like impossibilities, forcing the remaining crew to navigate by instinct rather than by blueprint. Time itself became unstable on the bridge, the main chronometer flickering between the present, a moment 3 seconds in the future, and a day last week. Through it all, Marshal Rostova stood like a statue of iron will, her hands gripping the command lectern, her eyes fixed on the seething, wounded god world ahead. She was no longer fighting a battle of tactics. She was piloting a myth, a spear of human defiance aimed at the heart of an impossible being. Eris Thorne worked beside her, his body frail but his mind a razor. He was a conductor orchestrating the flagship's death, fine-tuning the cascade of the singularity core. ensuring that its collapse would be as violent and conceptually chaotic as possible. The hum of the silencers was gone, but in his mind, he could now feel the raw, fractured thoughts of the lattice world, not a song of order, but a panicked, disjointed flood of pure mathematical agony. They were in pain, and they were terrified, and the sight of the charging, unbroken vow was amplifying that terror into a focused, targeted rage. Meanwhile, what was left of the Grand Armada was in full, panicked retreat. Commander Jorik, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest, executed Rostova's final order with brutal efficiency on the bridge of the dreadnought Leonidas, which had assumed the role of temporary flagship. He watched the unbroken vow dwindle to a single, defiant point of light plunging into the swarm. All ships, burn for the jump point, he commanded, his voice hollow. Do not engage. Do not look back. Just run. The retreat was not clean. The aberrations, sensing the fleet's disarray, fell upon the stragglers with ravenous fury. Jorik watched as the Starseeker, a science vessel that had been instrumental in analyzing the silencer's initial signal, was swarmed and simply erased from existence, leaving behind only a fading echo on the sensors. He saw the cruiser Gettysburg turn back, its captain making a suicidal last stand to buy the others a few more precious seconds before it too was unraveled. Every loss was a dagger in his soul, but he held the course. Rostova's sacrifice would be meaningless if no one survived to carry the warning, to deliver the lesson. They were no longer an armada. They were messengers fleeing a hell of their own making, their cargo a terrible and vital truth. Back on the bridge of the dying flagship, the end was approaching. The aberrations had torn the ship's external structures to shreds. The engines were screaming, running on little more than the sheer, stubborn will of the engineering crew. The main viewport was a spiderweb of fractured armor glass, and through it, the lattice world loomed, a monstrous, pulsating wound filling their entire field of view. Reactor containment is at 10% and falling. Marshal. The chief engineer's voice crackled over the comm, followed by a burst of static. She can't take any more. Rostova did not reply to him. She turned to Eris. Is it ready? Doctor. Eris nodded, his eyes glowing with the reflected light of his console. The singularity is unstable. When it collapses, it won't just detonate, it will invert. It will create a momentary rupture in the conceptual framework of this space, a single point of absolute infinite chaos. A no so loud it will deafen God. He paused and looked at the raging storm outside. I hope Lena can hear it. Rostova placed a hand on his shoulder. She will. She then turned and drew her sidearm, not in preparation to fight, but as an act of finality. She ejected the energy cell whilst rendering the weapon inert, and placed it gently on the command lectern. Her war was over. She had led humanity's greatest fleet, its loudest roar, and she would end it by becoming the ultimate weapon herself. It has been an honor, Dr. Thorne, she said, her voice quiet and clear. The honor was mine. Fleet Marshal Rostova, Eris replied, his fingers hovering over the final sequence activator. They stood there for a silent moment, two souls at the precipice of oblivion, the soldier and the scholar, embodying the two halves of humanity's spirit. Outside, the aberration swarmed for the final kill. Inside, Eris closed his eyes and pressed the activator. From Jorik's vantage point, at the edge of the system, the detonation was not a flash of light. It was a moment of absolute, impossible blackness, A sphere of pure void erupted from the point where the unbroken vow had been, a hole in reality that did not reflect light, but consumed it, along with the aberrations, the fractured silencer vessels, and the wounded lattice world itself. It was a silence more profound and terrifying than anything the silencers could have conceived. And then, the blackness collapsed, and from that single point, a wave of pure, untainted creation washed outwards. It was not fire or energy. It was a shock wave of potential, of every possibility happening at once, a scream of pure, unfiltered existence. It washed over the Lacuna system, and where it passed, the sanitized, gray worlds cracked and crumbled into natural, chaotic asteroid fields. The pale, sterile star at its center flared with a new, healthy, golden light. The wound that the silencers had carved into the universe was cauterized, cleansed by a paradoxical act of ultimate destruction and ultimate creation. When the light faded, there was nothing left. No silencers, no lattice world, no aberrations, and no unbroken vow. The system was just a system, quiet and empty. The terrible hum replaced by the gentle, natural hiss of the cosmic microwave background. The silence was back, but this time, it was real. It was empty. It was peace. Decades passed. Humanity did not celebrate the Battle of Lacuna as a victory. It was remembered as the Great Reckoning. The Grand Armada had been shattered, with less than a third of its ships returning home. The loss of life was astronomical, but the loss of innocence was absolute. Humanity had screamed into the void, and the void had very nearly screamed back louder. They had survived not through strength, but through a desperate, suicidal act of madness. The lesson was learned. Rostova's last order, "Get quieter," became the foundation of a new human philosophy. The aggressive expansion of the past ceased. Humanity pulled back, consolidating its existing territories, turning its gaze inward. The focus shifted from conquering stars to understanding them. Aris Thorne's theories became the basis for a new kind of science and a new kind of defense conceptual camouflage. Psychic dampeners built into the core of every new colony and ship, and a deep, abiding respect for the profound dangers of cosmic noise. Ethelberg was never repopulated. It became a protected memorial, the sanctuary of the unspoken, where the 10 million living, breathing, mindless victims were cared for with a reverence born of infinite sorrow. Their slow, steady heartbeats were a constant reminder of the price of their species' survival, a silent sermon on the sanctity of the individual mind. Admiral Jorik, old and gray, stood on the observation deck of the new orbital headquarters over Earth, a station named the Rostova. He looked out at the star charts, at the sector labeled Lacuna, which was now a permanently quarantined, interdicted zone. No one went in and nothing came out. It was a scar on their maps and on their collective soul. He was the last living witness of the command crew of the Grand Armada, and he had spent his life ensuring the lesson of that day was never forgotten. Humanity had learned that there were things in the universe so ancient and so vast that to even be noticed by them was a death sentence. They had survived their first encounter by being loud, and they knew their continued existence depended on learning to be quiet. They still built ships, still explored, still dreamed. But they did so now with a humility they had never known before. They moved through the galaxy not with a roar, but with a whisper. And in the profound, true silence that followed, they finally learned to listen.